Hey everybody, this is Jason Stallings and you are watching a video on my channel. If you want to check out my artwork, please visit www.jason-stallings.com, and I've got prints, originals, got some links to NFTs, other things like that. Today I want to kind of give you a brief overview of my creative process when creating my abstract artwork and how that's evolved over the years. Behind me is a second half of a piece called Risk plus Chaos equals Opportunity. I made this in 2008. It was part of a batch of my first few paintings, and this I was at the time trying to create a piece with the idea of trying to get it in front of the eyes of a local law firm. And this kind of goes into an interesting story about that approach, and that did kind of evolve later. So first of all, whenever I'm creating a painting, I've got the surface prepped, I've got some kind of texture created. Traditionally, most artists use real perfect, thin, soft layers. But I really like to work with a lot of textures, kind of creating this sense of depth through implied texture. That has sort of evolved into a literal texture with some things that kind of impasto-esque fiber paper. Golden makes, which they make two kinds. There's fiber paper and there's watercolor paper. Watercolor papers come in a few different types. I like the really coarse cold press type. But what's interesting about that to me is just this idea of working on a surface across different surface types. That originated out of almost kind of an accidental thing. I was creating a piece for a project that became the painting Can You See Me, which I made in 2006, and that became my first sold artwork. And so that originated out of a sort of accident. I had this big piece of Strathmore paper cut by a local art supply shop, Acrylic in Savannah, and I'd realized that it was not quite big enough, and it's actually pretty expensive at the time, or at least relatively speaking to me then, just for one project. Keep in mind, when you're in art school, you do spend a lot of money on art supplies. So I made a deal with the professor, like, hey, what if after talking to my dad, kind of had proposed the idea of like breaking up the paper into different sections and gluing it down with pH neutral glue onto the canvas. So that kind of originated that thing. I don't quite use the glued down paper method anymore. Not to say I wouldn't, but I just find the watercolor paste to be a little more consistent, and there's a lot less of an issue with kind of having to iron out any air pockets. So with that being said, I've already talked a lot about the base. I mean, like, the first few steps in this creative process are very lengthy and they're very crucial to the overall feel of a painting. But from here, and this process can take anywhere for an hour or two. Like, I've pondered over this for like months. But I will kind of come up with a series of sketches in my sketchbook, and think of an overall idea this concept or story that I'm trying to tell with it. And I mean, of course, anybody with a more organized approach not to say I've never been organized, I have, but initially it was just kind of put as many things together that tell a interesting story. And early on, they were really just very simple things like shapes and repeated patterns. But there was always a concept going on. I mean, like having an illustration background, the idea of telling a story is very important to me. And I applied the kind of creative sketching and thought process of illustration to a fine art context. But rather than working on a series of paintings that each focus on one little individual aspect of a concept, which I would do, but for some reason it's always just worked better if I just kind of lump them into one piece, or maybe a couple. I basically cover the canvas with these sketches, drawings at varying scales. Not always varying, but like they're usually more interesting, more dynamic if I do that. Sometimes they will overlap with each other, sometimes they'll be adjacent, sometimes the things will be very clear. In the painting behind me, that is, I think there are a few different languages, maybe ancient ones, that embodied the idea of law or order. And the center of it is chaos. So there's this circle with arrows going on all directions, because I think I literally just did a Google search for that, and that showed up, and I thought, well, that makes sense. Granted, back in these earlier days, I was thinking things in more immediate terms, just trying to get ideas together and not thinking too hard about them. But I think that earlier on, that led to some very successful solutions. And while I have developed into spending more time on my work, initially that kind of helped to just create a sense of quickness and energy and immediacy, which is very successful. So on top of that, I would do a layer of thinned out paint. Over time, initially it's just like heavily watered down acrylic. In certain areas, just kind of get washes of color on top of that. Because it's acrylic, earlier on actually the bases were made with like coffee. But I then moved to just having an acrylic base, and with like real high flow, like loose density acrylics, just mixing with a little water spray helps kind of mitigate that. But the washes are basically just, you pick one or two colors as your base color, then you cover certain areas of it, not all of it, but like maybe 40 to 50%. Yeah, depending on where you want to go with it, with like a base color. Like in this case, there's yellow and blue. It's mostly yellow. There's a little bit of blue. In back, black and brown are in the background. So on top of that, there would be a layer where I had thinned out black oil paint. I might mix the black with some deep blues and umbers or ochres, usually just umbers or siennas and blue. That way you have a more dynamic and complex dark value set. And again, these are made with washes. Now, since then, I've reverted to using water-soluble graphite instead of thin out oil. But initially, the idea was that with that hyper thin out oil with mineral spirits or paint thinner, once you let it dry to a certain point, you can use a kneaded eraser or some kind of white vinyl eraser to erase out certain parts. But it has to be thinned out enough. But then from there, you kind of have your immediate dark values in your painting on top of, or more next to your colors. And this is taken from a mixed media technique from a well-known illustrator, fairly well-known illustrator named C.F. Payne. And what he does is he uses acrylic, used to use, because I learned this technique, a highly carcinogenic and toxic sealer to create a new tooth, new surface. I don't quite do that. One, I don't want to get cancer. I don't think that they sell this stuff anymore. I think it was called Spectrafix. No, that is actually the stuff that's healthy. It was something completely different. But anyway, I digress. But each layer would be broken up with this kind of lacquer sealer. So you have, may not be lacquer. Sorry, it's been a long time. But in any case, you have this new layer to work on top of. But I've found that over the years I don't necessarily need that. But as long as the mediums are within a healthy proximity to each other but not interacting, I mean, like, the idea is that you will start with water-based mediums and you move up to your oils and your dries. Once you get that dark medium, later I would use, in other areas adjacent to the black, white gouache. Because I was realizing, and this came up in a critique with one of my former professors at SCAD, she said that she wasn't detecting like enough contrast, which is fair. I mean, like, the more contrast you have in a painting, the more dynamic it is. But in for instance, in the painting behind me, you see the soft pastels. That is supposed to be acting in place of that to a degree. It's more or less creating that high contrast pop that a soft pastel next to a black will do. But you basically just, like, it takes care of like many hours of rendering lights and darks that normal painting does, and a tenth of the time. So in essence, it's a more efficient way of painting. It's not perfect, but it works for what I do. And I think if you look at C.F. Payne's work, he's able to very immaculately render paintings and illustrations in this method with little no issue. Now, what he does in place of soft pastels is colored pencil. I've done that a little bit, but the just sheer like scale and size of my work mostly doesn't allow for that. In any case, once I get that, I would do like oil pastels or acrylics for line work, then soft pastels in certain areas. But, this is assuming all these other layers are dry first, and so you kind of, the process starts very slow at first and then rapidly gets quicker as you get towards the end. So with that in mind, from there, this is just kind of my approach. I get very into the work. I get very involved, and my brain just kind of shuts off and I just work with something. But the initial first half of it is very planned out. The second half is very much not, and very dynamic and very just kind of loose. But I really have always enjoyed that. Granted, the approach I've taken has definitely evolved over many years, especially when I've gone into like white on white style paintings. In those, I'm really forced to give a lot more consideration to the nuance of the colors I work with. And later on, I actually ended up including more oil paints because I got my hands on some really high quality Holbein stuff. That allowed me to really explore like really incredibly subtle and sophisticated colors. So, what started as a very quick and sort of loose and simple, almost kind of primitive process has evolved over the years, especially when I've started to incorporate some portraiture in some of my projects. So in any case, I usually seal some of the layers with like a spray fixative, like workable, especially in the water, or in the, not watercolor, but the soft pastels. Because it's important to kind of work with those and make sure that things are well sealed. And especially with one painting, and this kind of gets back to the story about the law firm, I ended up not getting this painting sold to that firm. It ended up going to a different client later, but because it was a little too obvious on the nose, and there's something to be said for some clients not wanting to be reminded of what they do on a daily basis and the art they have in their office. But when I created a commission for the law firm Lyons and Simmons in 2020, this is part of the discussion that went into the initial meeting about the commission, is I said, like, I want to create something that tells your story. I want it to be special and something that you can probably kind of talk about in your day-to-day practice with your customers and anybody who enters. And there were references to law because it was telling their story, and they did understand that, but they also wanted to give me the, freedom and bandwidth to explore that in a new way and more interesting and subtle way. So that kind of related back to their clients, their cases. And so, we kind of found a middle ground with that. So like there was kind of a challenge to my own preconceived notions about what you make for a client. But it was really interesting. I mean, in that particular case, I did these drawings based on references from pictures they sent me, used a old-fashioned light projector to get those paintings blown up because it was a 8 by 10 foot commission. So anyway, with that one, I think like the final layer, we use professional finishing sprays, and so this is definitely not traditional art making, but I've found it really rewarding and really interesting, and it's sort of challenged all the notions I had in art school, because I always thought that, everything under the sun's been done, and maybe in some ways, you never know when you'll surprise yourself. But anyway, thank you for watching, and again, please hit like and subscribe, and if you're interested in learning more about my work, visit my website, www.jason-stallings.com, or shoot me an email, jason@jason-stallings.com. Thank you. Bye.